It was a quiet Tuesday evening when Claire, a late-night security guard in an abandoned shopping mall, first noticed something strange. Claire was used to the eerie atmosphere. She worked the night shift at this old mall for over a year and had grown accustomed to the strange noises and ghostly echoes that bounced off the empty walls. But on that particular night, there was something different. The air felt heavier, the silence more suffocating. As the clock struck midnight, Claire did her usual rounds, scanning the empty corridors of the mall. The flickering overhead lights added an extra layer of unease. The mall had been closed for years, and the only people there were occasional maintenance crew were security staff like her. But as she turned the corner near the food court, she noticed something out of place. A figure standing motionless in front of a closed store. Her heart skipped a beat. The figure was tall and thin, draped in a long, dark coat that seemed to swallow the dim light. Claire couldn't make out any facial features, only the outline of the person against the empty backdrop of the mall. She hesitated, trying to reason with herself. Maybe it was just someone from the maintenance crew, though she couldn't recall seeing anyone else arrive that night. Taking a cautious step forward, she called out, her voice shaking. "Hey, are you lost?" The figure didn't move. It didn't even acknowledge her presence. Claire's stomach turned. She took a few more steps, the sound of her shoes echoing in the vast emptiness of the mall. The closer she got, the more her instincts screamed at her to stop. Then, in a moment of sheer terror, the figure slowly turned its head toward her. The motion was unnaturally slow, as if it was deliberating every movement. The face that was revealed, or what was supposed to be a face, was nothing but a hollow void. No eyes, no nose, just a deep, dark emptiness. Claire froze. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she fought the overwhelming urge to run. But her legs refused to move. The figure tilted its head, and she could hear something faint, a whisper like a soft breeze through the trees. It was unintelligible, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through her body. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into thin air. 1 second it was there, and the next there was nothing but empty space and the faint smell of stale air. Claire didn't wait for another moment. She bolted from the mall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For the rest of the shift, she stayed in the security office, her eyes darting to the monitors every few seconds, half expecting the figure to appear again. But it never did. Ryan had worked as a night nurse at StAnnesHospital for 5 years, and though the hours were grueling, the quiet solitude of the late shift was something he had grown to appreciate. The hospital was a place where life and death seemed to brush against each other in a delicate dance. But Ryan had never been one to believe in ghost stories. That is, until the night he met the woman in room 312. It was just after 2 a.m. when Ryan was asked to check on a new patient, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had been admitted earlier that day with a broken hip. She was resting comfortably, but the doctor had requested that someone keep an eye on her through the night. As Ryan entered the room, he noticed something strange. The curtains were drawn, but there was an unusual chill in the air. He stepped closer to the bed, his shoes clicking softly against the tiled floor. Mrs. Patterson was asleep, her frail form tucked under the covers. But as he checked her vitals, a cold shiver ran down his spine. He could have sworn he saw something moving in the corner of the room. It wasn't a person, but rather a shadow, a dark, swirling mass that seemed to shift and pulse for the life of its own. Ryan quickly looked away, chalking it up to exhaustion. But then, as he turned back to bed, he saw it. The woman's eyes, wide open, staring directly at him. "Are you all right?" Ryan asked, trying to mask his unease. Mrs. Patterson didn't respond, but her eyes followed him with unnerving intensity. He glanced down at the chart, trying to focus on anything other than the woman's unblinking gaze. Then, suddenly, a voice echoed in his mind. "Get out." Ryan jerked back, his heart pounding. He shook his head, trying to clear the disorienting sensation. There was no one else in the room, yet that voice was unmistakable. He turned toward the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. He yanked on it, but it was as if something or someone was holding it closed from the other side. With a panic breath, Ryan turned to face Mrs. Patterson. Her face had contorted, Her once soft features now twisted in a grotesque grimace. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, and the shadow in the corner seemed to grow larger, wrapping around the walls like a dark tide. Get out now. Ryan didn't hesitate. He ran for the window, flung it open, and climbed out onto the fire escape, his heart hammering in his chest. The night air was a welcome relief, but the sound of the woman's voice still echoed in his mind. Get out before it's too late. Samantha had worked at the Midnight Diner for over a year. It was a quiet, all-night diner on the outskirts of town, serving hot coffee and greasy food to the few souls who wandered in during the small hours. Most of the time, it was uneventful, just the occasional late-night trucker or an insomniac needing a cup of coffee. But one night, everything changed. It was just past 3 a.m. when a strange customer walked in. He was tall, with a thick coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. Samantha greeted him with a smile, but something about him felt off. The man's movements were stiff, mechanical, as if he was forcing himself to act normal. Coffee, Samantha asked, try to brush off the growing discomfort in her gut. The man nodded. Black, he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. Samantha made her way to the counter, but as she poured the coffee, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was staring at her. She glanced back. His eyes were hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but she could feel them on her. They burned through her skin like a fever. Her hand shook slightly as she set the cup in front of him. He took it, his fingers brushing against hers for just a moment. Cold, like ice. Is everything all right? She asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. The man didn't answer. Instead, he stared down into his coffee, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. Suddenly, the air grew thick, the lights flickering as if struggling to stay on. Samantha took a step back, her instinct screaming at her to leave. But just as she was about to walk away, she heard him whisper, "You shouldn't have come here." The word sent a jolt through her. She spun around, but the diner was empty. The man was gone. The door was still locked, the light still flickering. But the chair where he had sat was vacant. Only the coldness lingered. Samantha didn't stay another minute. She grabbed her things and left the diner behind. But she knew it wasn't over. That man, or whatever he was, had been waiting, and he wasn't finished with her. Jesse had always worked a night shift in the warehouse, an old, crumbling building on the outskirts of town. The company had been around for decades, but the building itself was practically a relic. Creaky floors, broken windows, and a flickering security system that barely worked. At night, it was just him and the occasional hum of machinery, making it the kind of job you did when you had no other choice. The pay wasn't great, but the solitude was sometimes comforting. One particularly cold evening, Jesse was working late, moving boxes around a massive, cavernous space. It was almost 4 a.m., and the building had long fallen silent. No trucks pulling up, no other workers roaming the floors. Just the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere high up, echoing through the dark, empty space. That was when he first heard the footsteps. At first, Jesse thought it was just his imagination. Maybe he was hearing things. Too tired, too lonely. But as he moved deeper into the warehouse, the sound grew clearer. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing across the concrete floor. They were too loud to be anyone else. There was no one else here, not this late. Jesse stopped in his tracks, his breath caught in his throat as the footsteps drew closer. Each step a deliberate thud, but no one was there. He peered into the darkness, straining his eyes to see anything, anyone. The lights above flickered, casting long, jittery shadows across the aisles of boxes and equipment. His skin prickled with fear. Then, without warning, the sound of footsteps stopped. Silence engulfed him, but Jesse's heart was hammered. He wasn't alone. Someone, or something, was in the building with him. He turned, half expecting to see a person, maybe another worker who had been sent in on a different shift. But there was nothing. The aisle stretched before him, dark and empty, just when he thought he could breathe again. A cold gust of wind swept through the warehouse. It was impossible. There were no windows open, no doors. The air felt wrong, unnaturally cold, like the chill of the tomb. Jesse's breath fogged in front of him. even though he could see his breath clearly. Then the whispering began. At first, it was barely audible, like a soft murmur at the edge of his hearing. But it grew louder. Words formed out of static of the cold air, unintelligible at first, then clear enough to make his skin crawl. Get out, before it finds you. Jesse's legs moved on their own, carrying him to the rows of shelves as the whispering continued. Each step felt like a battle against his own body, against the primal instinct telling him to run. But no matter how fast he moved, the footsteps were always just behind him, growing closer. He reached the back exit. The door was locked. The whispering turned to harsh, guttural voices. Leave now, leave. The lights overhead flickered and died, plunging the warehouse into pitch-black darkness. In that moment of utter blackness, Jesse could feel something shift in the air, something watching him, something that had always been there, waiting for him to make the wrong move. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. A coldness gripped his chest, as if something icy were pressing against him from all sides. He staggered, his breath shallow, and his fingers fumbled for his keys, desperately trying to unlock the door. But it was no use. The whispering grew louder and more insistent, and the footsteps began again, now surrounding him. They were closing in. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him from every corner of the dark. It wasn't until the next morning that anyone found Jesse. He was huddled in a corner of the warehouse, shaking, pale as death. His uniform was drenched in sweat, his eyes wide and unfocused. When they asked him what had happened, all he could say was, "It's still here. It's still watching." Jesse never returned to the warehouse after that night. No one knew what had really happened, but the whispers, the cold, the footsteps, they never left him. They followed him, always just on the edge of his hearing, always reminding him that something was waiting, something that had been there long before he ever walked in. Lily had always loved working as a night shift waitress at the Silver Oak Cafe. It was a quiet place, nestled on a desolate stretch of highway, and the hours were slow and calm. Most of the regulars came in for coffee or the occasional late-night snack, and everything seemed peaceful until that one night. It started like any other night. The rain was pouring outside, the sky dark and heavy with storm clouds. Lily was cleaning the counter when she noticed a man walk in. A tall figure wearing a hooded jacket, his face obscured by shadows. He slid into a booth at the back, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. Lily went over to take his order. He didn't look up at her, his face hidden beneath the hood. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and he ordered a cup of coffee. Black, he said, his voice rough, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. Lily nodded and walked the counter. But as she made the coffee, she couldn't shake the strange feeling that something wasn't quite right. She glanced back at the booth. The man was still there, unmoving, his back to the window. Minutes passed, and Lily couldn't stop looking at him. He was too still, too quiet. Most customers came and went, chatting and making small talk. But this man, he was like a statue. Eventually, she brought the coffee over to him. As she placed it on the table, she noticed that the man's hands were unnaturally pale, almost sickly. His fingers twitched slightly, as if he was trying to resist some unseen force. "Is everything okay?" Lily asked, her voice a bit more uncertain than she intended. The man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly lifted his head, revealing his face, or what was supposed to be his face. It was a smooth, featureless mask, like something out of a nightmare. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a blank, empty surface that seemed to stretch endlessly. Lily recoiled, her heart racing. But before she could turn away, the man spoke again, his voice now louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't have seen me." Lily stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. The world around her seemed to close in. The lights above flickered, and the temperature in the cafe plummeted. For a brief moment, it felt like she was drowning in the thick, suffocating air, her mind screaming for escape. The man's hands moved now, slowly and deliberately, lifting the cup of coffee. But as his fingers curled around the mug, the air seemed to warp, distorting in unnatural ways. The shadow of his hand stretched, twisting like a dark, ink-black silhouette. Before Lily could react, the cafe door slammed open with a deafening crash, and the man was gone. vanished in the storm outside, leaving nothing but the lingering chill in the air and a faint smell of something burning. Lily didn't wait another second. She ran out into the rain, shaking, her mind reeling. What had she just seen? What had happened? To this day, she can't explain what happened in the Silver Oak Cafe. But every now and then, she feels a chill in the air, hears the whisper in the dark, and knows whatever that thing was, it's still out there, watching. It had been a few weeks since Ryan's terrifying encounter with a woman in room 312. Since then, he couldn't shake the sense that something was watching him, something lingering in the shadows of StAnnesHospital. The whispering voices, the cold wind, and the strange presence had not left his mind. He told himself he was just imagining things, that it was the stress of working long hours in a hospital that had caused him crap. But deep down, he knew he wasn't alone in those long, quiet nights. One evening, Ryan was assigned a graveyard shift again. It was around 1:30 a.m. when he received a call about an emergency on the second floor. An elderly patient had collapsed and needed immediate assistance. Without hesitation, he grabbed his medical kit and sprinted toward the stairs. The hospital was unusually quiet that night, the only sounds being his hurried footsteps and the distant beeping of machines. As he neared the stairs that led to the second floor, something strange caught his attention. The lights above him flickered for a brief moment. He paused, glancing up at the dimly lit landing. The air felt heavier somehow, as if the hospital was holding its breath. Just a storm outside, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But as he continued up the stairs, Ryan noticed something else. There was an unnatural silence. The usual hum of the fluorescent lights was absent, leaving only the eerie stillness. He reached the top of the stairs and turned down the narrow hallway leading to the patient's room. His heart was racing as the sensation of being watched intensified. It was as if the walls themselves were closing in on him, pressing in with unseen hands. Ryan quickened his pace, trying to reach the patient as quickly as possible. But then, something made him stop in his tracks. From the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow move at the end of the hall. It wasn't the usual play of light and dark that occurs when the lights flicker. It was a solid figure, tall and thin, standing motionless just past the last room. Ryan froze, his blood running cold. The figure didn't seem like a nurse or any of the staff. There was something off about it, something wrong. He took a tentative step forward, squinting into the darkness. The figure remained still, but now it was as if it was aware of his presence. Its head slowly tilted in his direction, a faint, unnatural creak of his neck echoing in the still air. The hallway grew colder, and Ryan felt a chill crawl up his spine. Without thinking, he spun around and bolted back toward the stairs, his breath quick and shallow. But as he neared the stairwell, something stopped him. Something powerful. Something that made him feel as though the very floor beneath his feet was about to give way. He looked back down the hallway. The figure was no longer standing at the end of the hall. It was closer, much closer. Ryan's pulse hammered in his chest as he stumbled back, his eyes wide with panic. The figure was no longer a shadow. It was a solid form now, standing in the middle of the hallway, his head tilted unnaturally, and his limbs unervingly long. The air around it shimmered with a cold, unsettling presence. It had no eyes, no visible face, just an empty, gaping hole where its features should have been. Run, run, run. The voice, or what felt like a voice, echoed in Ryan's mind, urging him to escape. He didn't need any more encouragement. He turned and fled down the stairs, his heart pounding in his throat. Behind him, he could hear the faint scraping of footsteps, too slow, too deliberate. When Ryan reached the security desk on the first floor, he didn't even bother to explain. He just grabbed his jacket, ran out of the building, and didn't look back. Jack had been a janitor at the same shopping mall where Claire had seen a strange figure. He worked nights, cleaning the halls and doing odd jobs while the mall was closed to public. Like Claire, he had grown accustomed to the eerie quiet of the building after hours. The hollow echoes mop hitting the floor, and the strange sound of wind whistling through broken windows. But Jack had learned long ago to keep his head down and get the work done. The mall had been quiet for years, almost abandoned. That is, until the incident. One night, Around 2 a.m., Jack was doing his usual rounds in the far corner of the mall near the old theater. The place had been empty for ages. But Jack had a particular distaste for that area. Something about it always felt wrong. He couldn't put his finger on it. Just an overwhelming sense of dread that clung to the darkened space like a second skin as he walked past long rows of empty storefronts. He heard it, a door creaking. Jack froze. It was faint, but unmistakable. The slow, deliberate sound of the door swinging open. Jack glanced down the hall and saw something that made his blood run cold. A door, one that was supposed to be locked, was ajar. He checked it earlier in the night, and it had been sealed shut. His stomach tightened. The door was from the old service area, one that hadn't been used in years. Reluctantly, he approached, his heart pounding with every step. As he neared the door, it creaked again, as if inviting him inside. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Without thinking, Jack reached out and pushed the door open further, peering inside. It was pitch black, but then something shifted in the darkness. The shadows, darker than the absence of light itself, loomed in the doorway. It was tall, thin, and it seemed to breathe with strange, unearthly rhythm. Jack's instinct screamed at him to leave, but he couldn't move. The figure was motionless, yet somehow he could feel its presence, its attention fixed solely on him. Leave. The voice was clear, though it was no more than a whisper in his mind. And somehow, Jack found himself obeying. He stepped back, away from the door, but just before he turned to run, he heard something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A soft, deliberate laugh. It came from inside the darkness, and Jack knew, whatever that thing was, it had been waiting for him. He never went back to work after that night. The night was quiet at the hospital, the clock ticking away the hours as Jane, a nurse, made her rounds on the third floor. The lights above buzzed with the low hum they always did, and the air was thick with a familiar smell of antiseptic. But something about that night felt different. The hallways seemed darker than usual, even with the overhead lights, and the sounds of distant machines and patient murmurs felt muffled, as if the building itself were trying to silence her. At 3 a.m., she entered a room to check on a patient who had been admitted earlier that evening. The man was elderly, suffering from severe infection, and Jane had been concerned about his condition. When she entered the room, the patient's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling erratically. But it wasn't his condition that caught Jane's attention. It was a shadow standing by the window. The figure was tall, its limbs long and unnaturally thin, its face obscured by darkness. Jane's breath caught in her throat. She knew no one else was in the room. She had been the only one on the ship. "Excuse me," she called, trying to steady her voice, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned toward her with an eerie slowness. The movement was jerky, unnatural, as though it was barely able to function the way a normal person would. But it wasn't the way it moved that terrified Jane. It was the eyes, or rather, the lack of eyes. Just hollow sockets, dark and bottomless, staring straight at her. Without thinking, she backed out of the room, her heart pounding. But as she reached the door to leave, it slammed shut on its own, trapping her inside. The room grew colder. The figure moved closer, and the whispering began, a low murmur that filled her ears with words she couldn't understand. "You shouldn't have come." The walls seemed to close in, the shadows pressing on her from every direction. The patient in the bed, barely conscious, let out a soft groan, as if the figure was feeding off of him. "Help!" Jane screamed, but her voice felt small, drowned out by the overwhelming presence in the room. And just as suddenly as it had all started, the door to the room flung open and the figure disappeared. Jane didn't wait to see anything else. She rushed from the room, her mind spinning. She didn't understand what she had just seen, but she knew one thing for sure. Something dark had taken root in the hospital, and it wasn't finished yet. Tom had been working at the old library for years. It was a peaceful place during the day, filled with the rustling of pages and the occasional sound of chairs scraping against the floor as the patrons shifted in their seats. But at night, the library took on a different feeling. It was as if the place itself held memories, the kind that didn't belong to books, but to something darker, something much older. Tom had always felt a chill in the air after dark, but he'd gotten used to it. He had to. He worked a late shift most nights, restocking shelves, checking the books in and out, and doing minor maintenance. Tonight, however, was different. It was a Wednesday night, and the rain had been pouring relentlessly for hours. The usual peaceful silence of the library was accompanied by the rhythmic drumming of raindrops against the windows, and the occasional lightning strike lit up the building for a split second, only to plunge it into complete darkness for what felt like an eternity. Tom was alone, just as he had been for most of his shifts, but tonight, something felt wrong. The air was heavier than usual, thick with a presence that he couldn't quite describe. He kept hearing strange creaking noises that seemed to come from beneath the floor, as if something was moving down there. He brushed it off at first. After all, the building was old. The pipes, the beams, they all groaned when the weather changed. But these sounds weren't the usual creaks and groans of settling buildings. No, these were deliberate, slow, methodical. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, spurred on by the storm outside. But as the hours passed, the noises grew louder and more insistent. It wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling. It was coming from the floor, beneath his feet. Tom paced nervously between rows of bookshelves, trying to focus on his work. But the unsettling sound wouldn't stop. It sounded like scraping, like something or someone was dragging itself beneath the wooden floorboard. He stood still for a moment, straining to hear. The scraping stopped. His heart skipped a beat. Then, without warning, a loud bang echoed from beneath the floor. Tom stumbled back, nearly knocking over a stack of books. The noise wasn't just a thud. It was a hollow, sickening crack, as if something had hit the underside of the floor with great force. And then came a whisper, so faint that it almost sounded like the wind. Come closer. Tom's blood ran cold. He took a few cautious steps back toward the far corner of the library, his eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. He thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, a dark shape darting between the shelves. He blinked, and it was gone. Come closer. The whisper came again, this time more insistent, louder, but still impossibly quiet, like a secret only he could hear. He turned, his instinct screaming at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. Something was pulling him, forcing him to approach the source of the noise. The sound of scraping started again, this time much faster, as if whatever was beneath the floor was trying to claw its way out. The boards beneath his feet groaned, and suddenly, one of the floorboards cracked open, a small gap appearing between the wooden planks. Tom froze, his heart pounding in his chest. What he saw in the gap took his breath away. Too pale, bony fingers reached up from beneath the floor, their nails blackened and jagged. Slowly, the fingers curled, pulling something or someone up through the gap. The thing that emerged was barely human. Its skin was a sickly gray, stretched tight over its skeletal frame. Its limbs were thin and elongated, its body contorted in unnatural ways. Its face was the most horrifying part, a twisted, featureless visage. Its skin stretched so tightly that it looked like a mask of raw, distorted flesh. The thing's eyes, if they can even be called eyes, were black pits that seemed to swallow the light. It stared directly at Tom, and in that moment, he knew one thing with certainty. It wanted him. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that seemed far too large for its thin frame. It let out a low growl, like the sound of something crawling out of the deepest, darkest pit. Tom screamed, stumbling backward as the creature dragged itself further up from beneath the floor. His body moved on its own, racing to the door, but the thing was faster. It lurched toward him, its long, twisted arms reaching out, its fingers like talons. Tom took caught on something, sending him sprawling to the floor. He scrambled to his feet, but as he looked back, the creature was upon him. Its breath was cold and fetid like rotting earth, and it was so close that he could feel the chill of its presence seep into his skin. But just as the creature was about to grab him, the lights in the library flickered and died. For a split second, everything was silent. Then, with a deafening crash, the creature let out a screech that sent Tom's blood running cold. The air seemed to tremble with its rage. But when the lights flickered back on, the creature was gone. Tom lay on the floor, gasping for air, his heart pounding in his chest. The library was eerily silent once more, but he knew something had changed. The creature was still there, somewhere, lurking beneath the floor, waiting. Maya had heard the story. Everyone had. The rumors of strange things happening on the night shifts in the city hospital were well known by now. The inexplicable disappearances, the eerie whispers in the halls, the flickering lights. But she never thought it would happen to her. Maya was a new night shift nurse, just getting accustomed to the strange, haunted atmosphere of the hospital. On her first night, she had chalked up the flickering lights, the odd sounds, and the shadows moving in the corners of her vision to her exhaustion. But by the time her third week had come around, she could no longer ignore the signs. There was something in the hospital, something that shouldn't be there. The first incident occurred in the maternity ward. Maya had been checking on the newborns when she heard a soft lullaby. At first, she thought it was one of the new mothers, but as she moved down the row of cribs, she realized that none of the mothers were singing. The lullaby was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deep within the ward. Maya's skin prickled with unease as she followed the sound to a secluded corner of the room. There, in the dark, was a rocking chair. It was moving on its own, creaking back and forth. Despite there being no one in it, Maya stepped closer, her heart racing. But as soon as she reached out to touch the chair, the lullaby stopped. Silence. The chair stopped rocking. Maya couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She quickly turned and rushed out of the room. The second incident occurred the following week. Maya was working the midnight shift, checking on a particularly old and frail patient in room 505. The man had been asleep, but when Maya entered the room, his eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. "Something's coming," the man whispered, his voice raspy and weak. "It watches, it waits." Maya tried to calm him, but the man only repeated the same words over and over again. "It watches, it waits." Later that night, after checking on the man again, she noticed that his eyes were now closed. He was peacefully asleep, but there was no way she could forget what he had said. Maya hadn't been able to shake the images of room 505 from her mind. The old man's cryptic warning, his fearful eyes. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of him lying there, staring at the ceiling, replayed over and over in her mind. But it wasn't just that room. The entire hospital had started to feel wrong. The walls seemed to be pressing in on her, suffocating her with their silence. It was around 3 a.m. when the next incident occurred, just after Maya had finished her rounds on the oncology floor. The hospital was quieter than usual, almost unnervingly so. The beeping of machines in patient rooms had been replaced by an unnatural stillness. The fluorescent lights above buzzed, their hum barely audible as Maya walked through the long, sterile halls. Then she heard it, a whisper, so faint that it could have been mistaken for the wind, but it was unmistakably a voice. It was coming from the room at the very end of the hall, room 333. Maya stopped in her tracks. She had never had a patient in that room before, and as far as she knew, it had been empty for months. But the whisper persisted. "Help me." Maya's blood ran cold. The voice was soft, barely a breath, but it carried a sense of urgency that immediately set her on edge. Her instinct screamed at her to turn around and leave the floor, but something deep within her, compelled her to investigate. She stepped toward room 333, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to change. It felt colder, thick with the kind of tension that made her skin crawl. When she reached the door, it was slightly ajar, just enough for her to peek inside. The room was dim, the blinds drawn, casting long, shadowy lines across the floor. At first, she saw nothing. Then, her gaze fell on the bed. It was empty, but the whispering didn't stop. "Help me." Maya's eyes darted around the room, searching for source of voice, but there was no one there. No patient, no nurse, no sign of life at all. The room felt wrong, empty yet full, as though something was waiting just beyond her sight. And then she saw it. A small, thin hand, pale and trembling, appear at the edge of the bed. It was like a child's hand, but twisted and misshapen, with nails too long and jagged to belong to a human. The hand slowly slid across the bed, leaving a trail of froth behind her. Maya took a step back, her heart racing in her chest. But before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her, trapping her in the room. The whisper turned into a guttural, wheezing rasp that seemed to come from the very walls. Leave! Leave now! Panic surged through Maya as she tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The whisper grew louder, almost deafening now, and the air in the room grew frigid, colder than she'd ever felt it before. Her breath came out in short, sharp gasps, visible in the icy air that surrounded her. She turned toward the bed again, and this time, the hand was no longer the only thing in the room. A shape had begun to emerge in the shadows. A figure that was humanoid but twisted, distorted. Its body was thin, skeletal, its skin gray and mottled, as though it had been buried beneath the earth for years. The thing was hunched, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, his long fingers curling as if reaching for her. Its face was a hollow mass of pale, stretched skin, with deep, hollow sockets where its eyes should have been. And then it spoke, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to echo in every corner of the room. You shouldn't have come. Maya's blood ran cold as the creature reached out toward her with its gnarled hand. She tried again to open the door, desperate, her fingers shaking as they gripped the handle. The room felt smaller, tighter, as if it was closing in on her. The air grew heavier, suffocating her, and the creature's outstretched fingers grazed her arm. The sensation was like ice. A vision flashed before her eyes. Room 333, years ago, filled with a different patient. A man who had been locked away here for reasons no one ever explained. He had been muttering to himself about the shadows and the thing under the floor for days before it had disappeared. The hospital staff had all assumed he had gone insane. But the truth was darker than that. The man had become part of something much worse. A part of whatever dark entity that had taken hold of the hospital. And now it was coming for her, just as the creature's hand reached for her throat. Maya managed to wrench the door open, bursting into the hallway and stumbling away from the room. The things just echoed in the silence behind her, growing louder as it chased her. The lights flickered again, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Maya didn't look back as she sprinted down the hallway, but she could feel the presence behind her, closing in, following her every step. She reached the stairwell and ran down the stairs, not caring about the risk of falling or breaking something. She just needed to get out. When she finally reached the first floor, she burst through the emergency exit, the cold night air hitting her like a slap to the face. She didn't stop running, even as the gates of the hospital slammed shut behind her. But as she looked back, she saw something that made her blood run cold once more. At the windows of room 333, she could see a figure standing there, its face pressed against the glass. The same twisted skeletal face, with hollow eyes that stared at her. The creature was still watching. Ryan had heard the story. Just like everyone else at the hospital, he had heard about the strange happenings, the unexplainable events that seemed to plague the place. But after his encounter in room 312, he thought he had left it all behind him. He had quit his job, moved to another city, and tried to erase the horrors from his mind. But when he received the phone call that brought him back to StAnnesHospital, he knew he couldn't escape the darkness. His father, who had been ill for years, had been admitted to the very hospital Ryan had tried to forget. His father was in critical condition, and Ryan knew he couldn't leave him alone. He had to face it all. One last time. It was late when he arrived. The hospital was eerily quiet, just as he remembered. The staff was all busy, and no one seemed to notice him walking through the halls. Ryan made his way to his father's room, but as he passed by the old, forgotten wing of the hospital, he felt a chill run through him. Something was wrong. He could feel in the air a heavy presence that hung in the hallways, lingering in the shadows. He couldn't ignore it any longer. As he reached the door to his father's room, he turned to see the figure standing at the end of the hallway. Tall, thin, with a face twisted and hollow, just like the thing he had seen so long ago, the thing from his nightmares. It was here, and this time, it wasn't leaving. Ryan couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As he sat by his father's bed, the feeling intensified, like an unseen presence loomed just beyond the periphery, hidden in the dim shadows of the hospital room. His father, pale and frail, lay unconscious, his labored breathing the only sound in the otherwise quiet room. The air in the hospital felt thick and oppressive, like something ancient was stirring beneath the surface, something that had been waiting for him to return. After an hour of sitting there, Ryan couldn't ignore the rising sense of dread any longer. It was the same sense of unease he felt all those years ago.
Royalty-free music for
He
videos
worked
and
here as
media
a young
projects.
nurse, when everything had gone wrong. The whispers, the flickering lights, the cold, skeletal figures that seemed to haunt every corner of the hospital. He had hoped, desperately, that it had all been a nightmare, that his mind had played tricks on him. But now, standing in this room, his father's breath steady but shallow beside him, Ryan knew deep in his gut that whatever haunted this place, whatever cursed it, had never truly left. He was in the heart of it now, at the center of whatever darkness had claimed his hospital, and it wasn't done yet. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper broke the silence. Ryan turned toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a voice, low and raspy, like someone was speaking directly into his ear, but no one was there. The voice was just on the edge of hearing, too faint to fully understand, but unmistakable. It was the same voice he had heard so many years ago, the one that haunted his nightmares. Ryan, he froze, every muscle in his body tensing. His breath caught in his throat, but he couldn't bring himself to move. The voice called again, this time louder, more insistent. Ryan, you're here. You shouldn't be here. His skin went cold, and his pulse quickened. There was no way anyone else was in the room. His father was unconscious. The hallway outside was empty. So where was the voice coming from? He scanned the room frantically, his eyes darting to the dark corners, the windows, the ceiling. But everything was still. And then the temperature in the room plummeted. The cold wasn't just a drop in temperature. It was a bone-chilling, suffocating cold, like the very air itself was frozen. Ryan's breath turned to vapor as he tried to rise from the chair, but his body wouldn't obey. It was like invisible chains had wrapped around him, holding him in place. His heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on his skin as the whispering grew louder. Leave, Ryan. You don't belong here. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed in the hallway, the heavy thuds growing louder as they approached the door. Ryan tried to scream, to call for help, but his voice was caught in his throat, trapped by an unseen force. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and the air in the room seemed to shift. The shadows at the edges of the room began to stretch and twist, forming shapes that moved in unnatural ways, like the shadows themselves were alive. Ryan's eyes widened in horror as the figure stepped into the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, his body draped in tattered hospital sheets, and his face, oh God, his face. It was not human, not anymore. The face was a mask of decayed skin, stretched tight over bones, a hollow eye socket staring through it. Its mouth was a gaping hole, filled with jagged teeth that were far too large for its thin skeletal frame. The thing's skin was mottled with dark bruises, and its limbs were unnaturally long, bending at odd angles as it moved closer. It had the smell of rot, of death, of something ancient and foul. Ryan couldn't breathe. The thing's presence was suffocating, and as it took another step toward him, the temperature dropped even further. His vision blurred as his body seemed to freeze in place, locked in place by sheer terror. You shouldn't have come back. The voice rasped again, only this time, it wasn't coming from the creature itself. It came from every direction, surrounding him. You knew better. You knew, but you came anyway. The creature tilted its head, its hollow eyes never leaving Ryan. It opened its mouth, and a horrible, guttural growl rumbled from deep within its chest. The shadows in the room seemed to thicken, creeping toward him like tendrils of smoke. And then the whispers began again, rising to a deafening crescendo. They were no longer words. They were screams. Hundreds of voices, all screaming in agony. Voices of the lost, the forgotten, the tortured souls who had come before him. The sound was unbearable, like it was coming from inside his skull. No, please, Ryan managed to whisper, his voice shaking with fear. I never wanted this. The creature's twisted lips curled into a grotesque smile, its teeth gleaming in the dim light. It reached out toward him with one of its long, spindly hands. and Ryan felt the chill of its fingers brush his arm. "You are one of us now," the creature whispered. "We are the ones who wait. We are the ones who never leave." The room seemed to close in on him. The walls narrowing, the shadows growing darker and more suffocating. Ryan felt the weight of it all. The hospital's haunted past, the evil that had seeped into its very foundations, the creatures that waited in the dark corners, the things that never left. The thing's hand was inches from his face, and just as it was about to touch him, he screamed. When Ryan awoke, he was lying on the cold tile floor of his father's room, gasping for air, his heart raced, his head pounding as if someone had taken a hammer to his skull. His body was drenched in sweat, and his limbs felt weak, as though he had been drained of all energy. His father lay motionless in bed, but Ryan could hear the soft, steady rhythm of his breathing. The hospital room was still, eerily still. Ryan sat up, his eyes darting around the room. The shadows in corners seemed darker now, more oppressive, but everything was quiet. The creature was gone. The whispers had stopped. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream, perhaps a nightmare brought on by stress and exhaustion. But as he looked around the room, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The air around him was thick, like a presence was lingering just out of sight, watching him. And then he saw it, the reflection in the glass window, in the darkness outside, just beyond the hospital walls. There was a figure, tall, thin, its face obscured by shadow, and it was staring directly at him. Ryan's heart dropped into his stomach. It's not over, he thought. It will never be over. The next few nights in the hospital passed like a blur for Ryan. His father remained in a fragile state, slipping between consciousness and unconsciousness. But something within Ryan had shifted. He could no longer dismiss the feeling that the hospital itself was alive, sick, twisted, and pulsing with some malevolent force. It wasn't just the rooms or the patients. It was the very foundation of St. Anne's, the walls that seemed to close in around them, the floors that creaked and groaned underfoot as if they had their own secrets to whisper. Ryan couldn't shake the sense that something was always watching him, following him from room to room. And it had only grown worse since the night he saw the thing in his father's room. He hadn't been able to sleep. Every sound, every shadow seemed to be an omen. And every time he closed his eyes, the image of that figure staring at him through the glass window resurfaced in his mind. The thing had been waiting for him. It hadn't disappeared. It hadn't left. It had merely retreated into the darkness, biding its time. And now, Ryan was convinced it was waiting for him to make a mistake. The air in the hospital was thick with tension. He couldn't quite explain it, but every corner felt oppressive, like a weight was hanging over him, threatening to crush him if he didn't keep moving. He found himself avoiding certain hallways, rooms, and floors. He couldn't go back to the areas where he'd encountered the darkness before, where things had been twisted, distorted, and filled with screams from the past. But it wasn't just avoidance. There were moments, brief, fleeting, that made Ryan wonder the hospital itself was calling him back, pulling him toward the rooms that had been left behind, the places where the horror had first started. It felt almost like the building had an agenda, a purpose that he hadn't yet fully understood. It wasn't just the past that was trapping, it was him. He walked down the narrow, dimly lit hallway on the third floor, where the remnants of St. Anne's crumbling history still echoed through the cracked walls. The floors creaked beneath his boots. Fluorescent lights overhead flickered like dying stars. There were rumors about this part of the hospital, how the third floor was abandoned, the rooms sealed off, locked, and never touched. But tonight, something felt different. Ryan had told him to turn around, to leave, but his feet kept moving forward, compelled by some force he couldn't explain. The whispers from the night before echoed through his mind. "Ryan, you shouldn't be here." At the end of the hallway, he could see the door to room 313. He knew that room. He had avoided it since he'd started working at the hospital all those years ago. He had been told stories about it, but no one ever spoke in detail. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed it was a room where the last of the original staff had disappeared. There were no records of the patients who had been kept there, just empty files and a note that simply said, "Do not enter." But tonight, it felt like that door was waiting for him. Ryan's breath hitched in his throat, as he stood in front of it.
Unlimited
The air
royalty
around him
music
seemed
for
to grow
videos and
colder,
media projects.
his pulse quickening. He reached for the door handle, and just before he could turn it, he heard it, a soft, low whisper. Ryan, he froze, the hairs on his neck standing on end. He whipped around, but no one was there. The hallway was empty. Only shadows stretched and twisted in the light. There was no escaping it now. He had to know what was behind that door. With shaking hands, Ryan turned the handle and pushed the door open. The hinges groaned as the door creaked, revealing a dark, empty room. The faint smell of mildew and decay lingered in the air. The room was completely still, but Ryan felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He stepped inside cautiously, his shoes barely making a sound on the dust-covered floor. As he moved deeper into the room, the lights above flickered once more, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And then it hit him. The room wasn't empty. On the far wall, something was etched into the faded paint. It was scrawled in red, as if someone had scratched it into the wall with their fingernails. Ryan's breath caught in his throat when he made out the words.
Unlimited royalty-free
It's
music
not
for
over.
videos and media projects.
Not yet. Not ever. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This was it. The place where everything had begun. The room where the hospital's curse had first taken root. The evil that had plagued his building for decades. It wasn't just a presence. It was a force. It had been here long before Ryan had ever stepped foot inside, and it was waiting for him. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped drastically. Ryan's breath was visible in the air, like he was standing outside in the dead of winter. The shadows in corners of the room seemed to grow, creeping slowly toward him. He could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from behind. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Then the whisper returned. Leave now. Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He felt a cold, clammy hand grab his shoulder from behind.
Royalty-free music for
Touch
videos and
icy,
media projects.
like death itself had laid its fingers on him. He spun around to face whatever it was. But there was nothing, just the echoes of his own breathing. The door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of agonized voices, all pleading, all screaming, their voices mixing into a cacophony of terror. The walls seemed to be closing in on him, the shadows reaching for him, pulling him deeper into the void. Suddenly, a flash of light illuminated the room. For a brief moment, Ryan saw it, the figure that had been haunting him. It stood in the corner of the room, tall, thin, its eyes empty and hollow, its face a grotesque mass of decayed skin. It reached out toward him, and Ryan could feel its cold breath on his neck, its fingers brushing his skin. You are one of us now, the figure rasped. You can never leave. Ryan stumbled backward, his heart racing, but the darkness was closing in too fast. His mind was clouded with terror. Every inch of the room seemed to be alive now, the shadows moving, the whispers pressing in on him. He had to get out, but there was no escape. With a cry, Ryan pushed against the door, throwing his weight into it. The door creaked open just enough for him to slip through, but as he stepped into the hallway, he was met by something far worse than the darkness in that room. The hallway was filled. The figures, the creatures, lined the walls. Their hollow eyes stared at him, their faces twisted in silent screams. They didn't speak, but their presence filled the hallway, pressing against him, suffocating him. They were everywhere, watching him, waiting for him. Ryan staggered backward, but there was no way out. The figures closing on him, moving slowly, deliberately. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The shadows had already claimed him. Ryan had heard the stories, the rumors, the whispers had followed this place for years. But now, as the cold hands of the dead closed around him, he realized with terrifying clarity that the darkness would never let him go. It had always been here, waiting. And now, Ryan was one of them. The figures closed in the room and the hospital fell silent. The hospital was silent, but the silence was deceiving. There was a kind of stillness that pressed against your chest, suffocating, leaving you with a distinct feeling that something was wrong, dead wrong. In the weeks that followed Ryan's disappearance, the rumors started. Nurses spoke in hushed tones about how the third floor had gone quiet. No one had seen him leave. His father still lay in the same bed in room 207. was now surrounded by strange occurrences. The air grew colder every time someone entered the room. The smell of decay seemed to seep from the walls, and sometimes, only at night, the lights flickered on their own. The staff tried to ignore it, tried to convince themselves it was just the old wiring, the usual hospital quirks. But deep down, they all knew something was wrong.
Royalty-free music
They had known it for
videos and
years,
media projects.
ever since the hospital's dark past resurfaced. The disappearances, the unnatural occurrences, the stories of things seen in the corners of the mind. Figures just outside the edge of vision that watched, waited, and sometimes followed. But no one wanted to speak of it. They knew better. They had seen what happened to the ones who spoke too loudly, too openly. They'd heard the stories from few who had survived, those who worked the graveyard shift long ago, the stories about the things that lived in shadow.
TunePocket.com.
And still, life went on, but the darkness was patient. In the weeks after Ryan's disappearance, the hospital seemed to take on a life of its own. Its hallways grew colder, its rooms darker, the air thick with a lingering scent of antiseptic, was occasionally pierced by a stronger odor, a rock that didn't belong in a hospital, an otherworldly stench that could not be ignored. Nurses, once accustomed to the sterile cleanliness of St. Anne's, began to feel nauseous. Patients spoke of hearing whispers late at night, murmuring voices in the halls when no one was there. It was subtle at first, a low hum that buzzed just under the surface of their awareness. But then as the days passed, it became undeniable. And that's when they realized the shadows weren't just part of the architecture. They had always been here. They had always been waiting. And now they were awake. Samantha had only just started her new job at St. Anne's. She'd heard the stories, the murmurs of things not right about the place. But she wasn't the type to put much stock in urban legends. Hospitals were hospitals, after all, full of sickness, full of death. She figured she could handle the night shift, the quiet of the empty hallways. The fear was a distant echo, something other people dealt with. She was wrong. Samantha's first shift had been routine enough. The first few hours passed without incident, but the further she delved into the night, the stranger things began to feel. At first, it was the temperature. She couldn't explain it, but something about the air seemed wrong, cold in a way that chilled her bones. She rubbed her arms, trying to shake the discomfort, but it didn't go away. Then came the whispers. Samantha had been making her rounds, checking on the patients in the room when she first heard it. A faint murmur, like a voice too soft to be heard clearly, but still unmistakable. She stopped in her tracks, listening. It's not over. Not yet. Not ever. Her heart skipped a beat. Her skin crawled. She turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. There were no patients around. No staff. Nothing. Just the dim, flickering lights and cold, oppressive silence. She shook it off, telling herself it was just the stress of the night shift playing tricks on her. It was nothing. It was just her imagination. But when the whispers continued, louder this time, coming from somewhere deep within the hospital, she couldn't ignore it. Her breath quickened as she made her way down the corridor. The sound of her footsteps echoing in the eerie quiet. The whispers grew louder, closer. We are the ones who wait. We are the ones who never leave. Samantha's eyes darted around. The hospital seemed to stretch on forever, its hallways endless and twisted. She reached for her phone, ready to call for help, but when she looked down, the screen was cracked, static running through it like a malfunctioning television. Suddenly, a door to her right creaked open on its own. She hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached the door. Something was pulling her toward it, a strange compulsion she couldn't explain. She stepped inside. The room was dark, almost pitch black, save for the pale blue light from the moon filtering through a small, high window. She could make out shapes in the darkness. Shadows that shifted, as if they were moving of their own accord. But what caught her attention wasn't the darkness, nor the shadows. It was the writing on the wall. It's not over. Not yet. Not ever. Her breath hitched. Her pulse quickened. The whispers were deafening now, all around her, coming from every direction. She backed away, her hand reaching for the door, but it slammed shut with a force that sent her crashing into the floor. Samantha scrambled to her feet, her heart racing in her chest. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pulsating with the sounds of the whispers. She turned in circles, trying to find a way out, but it was no use. The shadows were closing in, and then she saw it, a figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the far end of the room. Its face was hidden in darkness, but its eyes were like hollow voids, staring at her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stepped forward, its long limbs stretching unnaturally as it glided across the floor. It raised a hand, pointing at her. "You shouldn't have come back." Samantha's body froze in terror, her mind screaming for escape, but there was no escape. The figure was upon her, its cold fingers brushing her face, sending a wave of icy dread through her entire being. And then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the room went completely dark. In the days that followed, Samantha's disappearance became another tragic chapter in the dark history of StAnnesHospital. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. They only intensified. The staff, now too afraid to speak openly, exchanged nervous glances. They had heard the story. They knew what happened to the ones who questioned the darkness, who looked too closely at the things hiding in the shadows. No one ever found Samantha. Her last shift ended just as the others had. Quiet, uneventful, routine. But the hospital had claimed her, as it had claimed so many others before her. Ryan's story had been whispered about in the halls, too. How he'd been lost in darkness. How he disappeared without a trace. And now, it seemed the same fate was befalling anyone who dared to work the night shift. But there were some, the ones who had been there the longest, who knew the truth. They had seen the figures lurking in the shadows. They had heard the whispers. They had felt the darkness grow stronger as the years passed. They knew that StAnnesHospital wasn't just a building. It was a tomb, and the darkness inside was never finished. It waited, always, for the next victim, and the next, until the hospital had claimed them all. The hospital had become a living nightmare. The once quiet halls of St. Anne were now filled with a constant, unsettling tension. The air was heavy, and the sense of dread that clung to the walls seemed to grow thicker with each passing day. The staff tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but they all knew the truth now. There was something in that place, something ancient, something cruel. The darkness had awakened, and it had no intention of letting go. Nurses and doctors, once confident and driven by the desire to heal, now worked in silence, eyes darting nervously from shadow to shadow. They knew that something had changed. It wasn't just the strange disappearances or the eerie whispers that followed them at night. No, it was something far worse. The hospital itself had become trapped, and every day it claimed more and more of them. As the days wore on, whispers spread among the remaining staff members. No one spoke aloud, but everyone knew there were rumors of a hidden chamber beneath the hospital, an old, forgotten room that no one dared enter. The building itself had been constructed over something far older, something buried deep beneath the foundation, and whatever was, it had been waiting, just waiting for the right moment to rise. Dr. Sarah Montgomery, a seasoned surgeon who worked at St. Anne for over a decade, had always dismissed the rumors as superstition. But when she found herself working the night shift alone one evening, she couldn't shake the growing feeling that something was terribly wrong. The whispers were louder now, more persistent in the shadows. Oh, the shadows seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. It had started with small things. Patients would suddenly complain of cold spots. And some of them had even mentioned seeing figures standing by their beds at night. But it was the patients who hadn't spoken in days, who had once been comatose, that concerned Sarah the most. Every time she checked on them, their eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling. Some of them even seemed to be mouthing words, though they remained silent when she leaned in close. One evening, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. She descended into the depths of the hospital, her mind racing with both fear and curiosity. The basement, the oldest part of St. Anne's, had always been a forbidden zone. There were no records of what was down there. It had been locked off long before she had arrived. But she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that whatever had begun haunting the hospital had its roots in the very bowels of the building. The elevator creaked as it descended to the lower level. The flickering fluorescent lights above her cast an eerie glow across the metal walls. When the doors finally opened, a wave of cold air hit her like a slap in the face. The basement was pitch black, save for the dull light from the hallway outside. Sarah stepped out cautiously, her footsteps echoing unervingly in the silence. She made her way to a long-forgotten storage room at the end of the corridor. The door was old, the paint peeling, and there was a rusted padlock hanging loosely from the doorframe. She had heard the rumors about the sealed room, about the old crypt beneath the hospitals, but she had never truly believed them. Now, as she stared at the padlock, she felt the weight of her own doubts. With trembling hands, Sarah forced open the door. The air inside was musty, thick with dust and the smell of decay. Her flashlight flickered before she shone it across the room. The light caught on rows of old files stacked in tall, dust-covered cabinets. But there was something else, something more disturbing. In the center of the room stood a large iron door. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. Old, rusted, with strange markings etched across its surface. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, the hairs on her arms standing up. There was no mistaking it now. This was the heart of the hospital's darkness. The source. The whispers were back. "You shouldn't have come here, Dr. Montgomery." She froze. The voice was soft, like a breath on the back of her neck, but unmistakably clear. Her heart began to pound as her eyes darted around the room. But she saw nothing. No one was there. The voice had come from nowhere, but she knew it wasn't a voice from the physical world. No, this was something older, something more terrifying. This was the sound of the hospital itself speaking. She reached for the door handle, but the cold metal seemed to burn her skin, causing her to recoil. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the room. Her pulse quickened, the oppressive pressure building in her chest, as the air seemed to thicken with each passing second. Leave now, or be trapped forever. With shaking hands, Sarah grabbed the handle again, forcing the door open. It groaned in protest, but she wrenched it wide. Behind it, the room was dimly lit by a faint, greenish glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. As she stepped inside, she saw something that nearly stopped her heart. In the center of the room was a large stone slab, bloodstained, old and dark, marred its surface. The walls around her were lined with old, cracked mirrors, reflecting twisted images that shouldn't have been possible. Figures that flickered in and out of sight, their faces twisted in agony, reaching out toward her with empty hands. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what this room was. It was an altar, but what had been done here, and why? Before she could make sense of it, a cold hand gripped her ankle. She screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the rising chorus of whispers. The walls trembled as the shadows seemed to come to life, reaching for her, pulling her down to the cold, blood-stained slab. The figures in the mirrors began to writhe, their twisted faces staring at her in judgment, as if they knew her fate. "You are too late, Dr. Montgomery. This place will never let you go." With one final, desperate cry, Sarah was dragged into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind her, and the room fell silent once more. Days passed, weeks, but St. Anne's Hospital, once an institution for healing, had become something far worse. It was now a place of unspeakable horror. The staff who remained were few, and those that stayed lived in constant fear. No one dared to speak openly about the things they had seen or heard. They knew, deep down, that no one would believe them, and those who tried, well, they were never seen again. But the whispers continued. The shadows moved, creeping along the walls, curling around the corners of the rooms. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. It wasn't just the staff. The patients, too, began to change. Some of them spoke of things that should not have been possible. Tales of creatures in the dark, of figures that walked through the walls. Others stared vacantly at the ceiling, their eyes empty, as if they had seen something no one should ever see. And still, the hospital endured, like a living thing. It pulsed with a dark energy, its foundations sinking deeper into the earth, feeding off the darkness that had always been there. But the final horror, the one that would bring everything crashing down, had yet to arrive. In the heart of the hospital, where the blood of the past had seeped into the floors and the walls, something was stirring. The curse had awakened fully, and there would be no escape. Years passed since the hospital had been abandoned. The once thriving StAnnesHospital, now just a decaying husk of what it used to be, sat silent at the edge of town. The windows were boarded up, the doors locked, and the halls were filled with nothing but dust and the occasional rustle of stray animals. To the outside world, the building was simply another forgotten relic of the past, a dark, rotting memory of something that had once been a part of the town's history. But for those who dare to remember, who couldn't forget the horrors that had occurred within those walls, StAnnesHospital was far from abandoned. The darkness still lingered. The whispers were still there. No one knew how or why the hospital had been built in the first place. It was as if it had been born of a need, a hunger, long before anyone had even thought to fill it with patience. Some believed the building itself had a mind, a twisted, evil consciousness that fed on the suffering of those trapped within its walls. And it wasn't finished yet. Maggie, a local urban explorer, had heard the rumors, the stories of strange happenings at St. Anne's. People talk about shadows in windows, flickering lights, and unexplainable noises that seemed to come from deep within the building. Some even claimed to have seen figures standing in the windows, pale, twisted faces peering out from behind the glass. At first, Maggie was skeptical. The idea of haunted hospitals, creepy old buildings, and ghostly figures seemed like a tired old trope. But curiosity gnawed at her, and when she saw the wreckage of St. Anne's from afar, she knew she couldn't resist. She had to see it for herself. On a chilly autumn evening, Maggie made her way toward the hospital's outskirts, flashlight in hand. The wind howled through the overgrown trees, making the branches creak and groan like ancient bones. The building loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette a jagged scar against the night sky. She entered through a broken side door, the rusted hinges protesting with an eerie squeal. The stench of mildew and decay hit her like a punch to the face, but she pressed forward, determined to document everything she saw. The air inside the hospital was thick, as though the very atmosphere was saturated with years of suffering. Maggie's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating empty hallways, abandoned rooms, and broken medical equipment that lay forgotten. Her footsteps echoed eerily, making her skin crawl, but she kept moving forward, undeterred by the growing unease in her chest. She ventured deeper into the building, her footsteps leading her toward the basement. The further she went, the colder it became. It was as if the temperature dropped with every step she took, and the air grew heavier, thick with the sensation that something was watching her. Her flashlight flickered, casting unsettling shadows across the walls. Maggie hesitated but shook her head, telling herself it was just a glitch. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the place was alive, that it was watching her, waiting for her. When she reached the basement, her breath caught in her throat. The door at the end of the hall, the same door Sarah Montgomery had once opened, stood ajar, inviting her in. The very same door she had seen in the stories. She felt the urge to turn back, but something pushed her forward, a strange compulsion she couldn't explain. The whispers were back. "You shouldn't have come here, Maggie." She froze. Her heart raced in her chest. There was no one else in the building. She was alone, but the voice, it came from nowhere. Her hand shook as she pushed the door open. The room inside was just as it had been described. A stone altar, old mirrors reflecting warped and twisted images, and the unmistakable feeling of being in the presence of something far darker than the world could comprehend. As Maggie stepped inside, the temperature dropped further and the whispers grew louder. She could hear them now, all around her, their voices overlapping, speaking words she couldn't fully understand. "We are the ones who wait. We are the ones who never leave." A cold hand brushed her shoulder. Maggie spun around, but there was no one there. The altar before her seemed to pulse, alive with an unnatural energy. Her eyes locked onto the cracked mirrors lining the walls. She saw them then, the faces, twisted and pale, staring back at her. They were not reflections of her own. They were the faces of the lost, of the ones who had vanished within these walls. "You're too late," they whispered in unison. "It's never over." Before Maggie could react, The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, trapping her inside the cursed room. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the temperature plummeted, her breath turning to mist in the frigid air. The whispers grew louder and louder until they consumed her thoughts completely. The shadows, like living things, reached for her, pulling her into their depths. Her body was frozen, her mind numb, and the overwhelming darkness seemed to engulf her entirely. The last thing she heard was the echoing cry of someone or something that had been lost to this place long before her. And then silence. Years passed, but the haunting of StAnnesHospital continued to echo in the minds of the townspeople. The building stood empty, abandoned by the living, but never truly deserted. Its decaying walls held the weight of so many untold stories of lives lost and souls trapped within. The hospital became a ghost of itself. Its legacy now a whispered legend that lingered in the dark corners of town. But the hospital had not yet finished its work. As the years went by, more people began to disappear. The stories never truly faded, and they became more frequent. Some believed it was a lingering curse of St. Anne's. Others thought it was just the building's reputation growing darker over time. But those who knew the truth whispered amongst themselves. The hospital was waiting for something. The last known residents of the town who still spoke about the hospital had begun to age. Some even wondered if the darkness had finally claimed them too, their minds too broken to remember the truth. But for one last soul, a final chapter was about to be written. It was a foggy evening when Ben, a journalist hungry for the truth and hoping for his big break, arrived at the gates of StAnnesHospital. He had heard the stories, had read the old reports, and felt the compulsion to see it with his own eyes. The mystery of the abandoned hospital was like a magnet, drawing him in. He parked his car outside the gates, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and fear. This was what he had been chasing. The truth about St. Anne's, the reason behind the disappearances, the strange occurrences. What had happened to those lost souls? With a flashlight in hand, Ben stepped through the rusted gates and made his way toward the hospital's front door. He felt a shiver run up his spine, but he pressed on. The hospital towered above him, its silhouette like an ominous giant against the gray sky. As he entered the building, the air seemed to change, heavy, thick with an unnatural chill that made his skin prickle. The silence inside was suffocating, and the stale smell of decay lingered in every room. He took cautious steps forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Each step seemed to echo, each hallway twisting and turning deeper into the hospital's bowels. Ben had no idea what he was looking for, only that he had to keep going. He made his way toward the basement, the place where so many had met their end, the place where the stories began. When he reached the stairs that led down into the deep shadows, the air grew colder still. He could hear it now, the faint whispers, low and garbled, like voices trapped in the walls. He could not make out the words, but the feeling of being watched consumed him. With a deep breath, he descended. At the bottom of the stairs, Ben found himself standing before the same old iron door, the one that had once called to Sarah Montgomery. The door was now rusted and warped, the handle cold to the touch. He could feel the darkness beyond, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for him. Ben had no time to second-guess himself. He turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was dark, but Ben's flashlight illuminated the stone altar in the center, the cracked mirrors that lined the walls, and the old symbols etched into the floor. The air was oppressive, as if the room itself was a living, breathing thing. He could feel his heartbeat quicken, and a knot tightened in his stomach. He wasn't alone. The whispers were louder now, clearer, and the voices were not the past. They were here, with him, now. You shouldn't have come. Ben's blood ran cold as the temperature dropped further, and the shadows began to move, slowly, as if drawn to him. They slithered along the walls, stretching out like dark tendrils reaching for him. The faces and mirrors began to shift, their eyes locking with his, their mouths opening in silent screams. His body went rigid as he felt something brush against his back, a cold, clammy touch that seemed to seep into his very bones. The darkness surrounded him, pressing in on him, filling his lungs with suffocating weight. And then from behind him came a voice, one he recognized, the voice of Sarah Montgomery. It never ends. Ben spun around, but there was nothing there. His flashlight flickered, and for a moment, the room seemed to distort. The shadows flickered and figures appeared. Pale, twisted forms that looked both familiar and alien. The mirrors reflected nothing but darkness now, no longer showing the twisted faces of the lost, but instead pulling him into their depths. You're here forever now. His mind spun with fear, trying to process what was happening. Was this real, or had he finally lost his grip on reality? But deep down he knew the whispers were no longer just in the air. They were in his mind. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The shadows closed in, crawling over him, suffocating him with their cold touch. His heart pounded as he fought to break free, but it was no use. The darkness was far stronger than he ever could have imagined, and as his vision blurred, the last thing he saw was the faces in the mirrors, twisted, empty, and hollow, staring back at him with pity. StAnnesHospital had claimed him, too. It was a cold winter morning when the town's people gathered in hushed groups, exchanging stories of strange occurrences. No one knew exactly when it began, but the unease had been growing for weeks. The once-forgotten StAnnesHospital, still a looming structure at the edge of town, was no longer a quiet relic of the past. It had become something else, something far more sinister. For the last time, the whispers had returned. They were no longer confined to the shadows of the building. The voices had traveled, seeping into the town itself, carried by the wind that whispered through the trees. They found their way into the homes of the elderly, the children, even the dogs. Those who lived near the hospital could hear them most clearly, faint but unmistakable, like a chilling reminder that the darkness was still very much alive. And it was growing stronger in the dead of night, when the moon hung high above, casting long shadows over the town. Something stirred inside the hospital. It wasn't the wind that rattled the windows, nor the creaking of a decaying building. This was different. The walls, which had been silent for so long, were now alive with a low hum, like the deep vibration of something waking up. Inside the forsaken hospital, the old iron door that had once been the entrance to the cursed basement trembled. It had been left unopened for years, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and decay. But now, the door quivered as if it had a pulse of its own, a heartbeat that echoed through the silent halls. No one dared approach it anymore. The door had become a symbol of the hospital's darkest secrets, of the lives that it consumed. But tonight, it called out to someone who could no longer resist the pull. A figure stepped into the hospital. It was a man, older than most of the ones who had disappeared. But there was something about him. He had come to town a month ago, a man named David, seeking the truth behind the rumors. He had heard the stories of St. Anne's, the disappearances, the twisted legends, and now he was here, stepping into the very heart of it all. He had no idea what awaited him. David's flashlight pierced the darkness as he moved through the halls, each step heavier than the last. The air was thick, musty with the weight of 1,000 untold stories. The building itself seemed to groan under the pressure of all that had happened within its walls. As he reached the basement door, a cold chill ran down his spine. The whispers were louder now, more urgent. They seemed to be calling to him, pleading with him, "Do not open the door. Do not come any closer." But David didn't listen. With trembling hands, he grasped the cold metal handle and twisted. The door swung open with a creak that echoed through the dark corridors. Beyond the door, the room was suffocating, bathed in a sickly greenish light. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and something far worse, something ancient and decayed. At the center of the room was a stone altar, stained with the blood of countless victims. But tonight it was not empty. There were shapes in the darkness, figures that shifted in and out of the light, their eyes fixed on him. The whispers surrounded him, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words twisted and unintelligible. "You shouldn't be here. You can never leave." David stepped back, his heart racing in his chest, but the room seemed to close in on him. He could feel the temperature dropping, could feel the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressing down on him. The mirrors that lined the walls reflected nothing but darkness. No faces, no shapes, only the void as the years rolled by. StAnnesHospital continued to decay, abandoned yet untouched by time. It became nothing more than a relic, a piece of forgotten history. crumbling under the weight of its dark past. The townspeople, though they spoke of it in hushed whispers, moved on with their lives. They carried on, pretending that the horrors of St. Anne's had never existed. But deep down, they all knew the truth. The hospital had not been abandoned. It had simply grown more patient. The darkness inside it waited, hungry and relentless, its grip on the building as strong as ever. It had waited for years. It would wait for centuries, if need be. The curse of St. Anne's was eternal. It would never release its hold on the souls it had claimed. And so, in the cold, silent nights, when the fog rolled in from the sea and the wind carried strange, unplaceable sounds, the whispers returned. You shouldn't have come here. You will never leave. No one could explain the stories of those who disappeared. The few brave souls who ventured too close to the cursed building, their names forever lost time. The last who dared were forgotten. The hospital's curse was subtle, drawing its victims in slowly. It was not the shock of immediate death that haunted those who entered. It was the way the darkness warped them, claimed them slowly, until they too became a part of the hospital's twisted legacy. For St. Anne's didn't just take bodies. It took minds, it took spirits. It made sure that no one truly left. Everyone who had ever walked through its gates became part of its story, whether they knew it or not. Their souls were trapped, their memories twisted and trapped in the building's maze of corridors and dark rooms. They would never be free, and as the hospital stood in eerie silence, the building itself was alive. The walls whispered in their twisted tongue. The air grew thick with the lingering spirits of those who had fallen victim to its grasp. One night, years after Ben's disappearance, the hospital's silent torment finally became a truth too undeniable to ignore. A lone hiker, passing through the area on a cold, foggy evening, noticed the hospital standing still and looming in the distance. He had heard the rumors, of course, about the abandoned hospital that no one dared approach. But curiosity gnawed at him. He figured he could walk past, take a glance at the crumbling ruin, and leave it behind like everyone else. But something compelled him, a curiosity deeper than he had ever felt before. He approached the building, the fog thickening around him. The door was ajar, the same way it had been for countless others who ventured too far into its clutches. His heart raced, but he shrugged off the growing unease and entered the building, flashlight in hand. The halls were silent, eerily so. The only sound was the creak of old wooden floors beneath his feet and his own shallow breathing. He ventured deeper into the hospital, the darkness closing in as he made his way toward the basement, where the heart of the horror lay. Just as he reached the bottom of the stairs, a shiver ran up his spine. The air grew impossibly cold, and the whispers began. "It's too late. You shouldn't be here. Now you'll never leave." The words were faint at first, but soon they grew louder, more insistent. His flashlight flickered, and in the brief moments of darkness, he saw them, the figures, faces twisted in agony, reaching out from the shadows, their empty eyes staring at him. Panic set in as he turned to leave, but the door to the stairs slammed shut, locking him inside. The shadows closed in around him, and the temperature plummeted even further. He screamed, but no sound escaped his lips. It was as if the building had swallowed his voice, silencing him forever. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the altar in the center of the room, the mirrors that reflected no one but the twisted souls trapped inside, and the faint, cold touch of something brushing against his arm. And then, nothing. The years dragged on, and the town surrounding St. Anne's Hospital moved on with their lives. They built new homes, new schools, and businesses. The once bustling streets were now filled with the sounds of life, of progress, and of forgetfulness. The stories of the hospital, of the lost souls trapped within, became distant memories, almost folklore, a ghost story told around campfires and in hushed voices. But St. Anne's, in its lonely, decaying state, was far from forgotten. It stood there in the distance, cold and silent, its walls scarred by the horrors it had witnessed. The windows remained dark, and the air around it seemed perpetually thick with something darker than the world could explain. Some people would still occasionally venture to the outskirts of the hospital, eager to see for themselves the place of legend, only to disappear, swallowed by the abyss of its cursed halls. The town would hear rumors of another lost soul, another missing person, but the whispers in the dark were always louder. The fear had become part of the landscape, passed down through generations like a dark inheritance. The truth was undeniable. No one truly escaped. It was on a particularly stormy night when an unexpected visitor arrived. A journalist named Claire, drawn to the legend of StAnnesHospital, had heard enough stories to fill a book. Despite the warnings of the locals, despite the countless disappearances over the years, she couldn't resist. There was something about the place, an inexplicable pull that she couldn't ignore. She had to go. She had to see it for herself, to write the definitive piece that would finally put the story to rest. Claire stood at the gates of St. Anne's, her heart pounding in her chest. The wind howled around her, rain splattering against the ground as she approached the entrance. The hospital loomed before her, its once grand structure now a shadow of its former self, crumbling and broken. But in the darkness, it still had a presence, a malevolent energy that could be felt even from the outside. She entered, as so many before her had, the air heavy with the scent of decay and age. The moment she crossed the threshold, a deep sense of unease settled in her stomach. The silence was oppressive, as though the entire building was holding its breath. The whispers were faint but unmistakable, like a low murmur rising from the walls. Claire walked deeper, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, revealing old equipment, broken furniture, and peeling paint. Each step she took felt heavier, as though the building itself was dragging her down, deeper into its core. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her, watching her, waiting for the right moment. And then she found the basement door, the very door that had drawn in countless souls before her, the door that had been a focal point of so many horror stories, the same door that Sarah Montgomery had opened, the same door that had sealed the fates of so many others. She hesitated, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her, but curiosity overpowered her caution. She opened the door and descended into the darkness below. The basement was unlike anything Claire had imagined. The air was thick and cold, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, writhing in the corners of the room. Her flashlight beam flickered briefly, revealing the altar in the center of the room, a stark reminder of the place's twisted past. And then there was a sound, faint at first, but growing louder. A whisper. No, not just one whisper, but a chorus of voices, overlapping, pleading, crying. They filled her ears, filling her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. You shouldn't have come. You'll never leave. We are the lost. We are the forgotten. Join us. Claire's heart raced. She tried to turn, but her legs wouldn't move. It felt as though the room itself was alive, pulsating with a dark energy that gripped her very soul. She could feel the coldness creeping into her skin, sinking into her bones. And then she saw them, the faces in the mirrors, twisted, warped, eyes wide with terror, mouths silently screaming. The figures were not just reflections. They were real, reaching out from the mirrors, pulling at her, drawing her in. Their hands were pale and skeletal, their expressions blank with the horror of eternal imprisonment. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, sharper, and she could feel herself being dragged toward the altar. The floor beneath her shifted as if the building itself was alive, moving, eager to claim her. You will stay with us. Forever. Claire struggled, but the darkness was overwhelming, suffocating. She fought against the force, but it was no use. The shadows closed in, consuming her, and the last thing she heard before everything went black was the faintest whisper. Another one added to the collection. The fog rolled in thicker than ever, wrapping around StAnnesHospital like a shroud, as if the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter to begin. The town had forgotten, or perhaps chosen to forget, the terror that lay within. But for those who truly knew, the legends were impossible to silence. They whispered them to their children, half in jest, half in warning, hoping the memories would fade like the damp stains on the hospital's crumbling walls. But the truth was darker. The hospital had not stopped its hunger, nor had it stopped claiming the souls foolish enough to approach. It waited, biding its time, patient as the shadows that stretched long and cold across its deserted halls. A few months after Claire's disappearance, the town had already begun to move forward. Her name had become another sad note in the growing list of those who dared to enter the old building and never returned. As life continued, One thing became undeniable. The stories of StAnnesHospital, no matter how often they were dismissed as urban legend, refused to die in the darkness of night. When the wind howled just right, people could still hear the faintest whispers on the wind, the names of those lost, trapped within the crumbling walls. But what people didn't know was that the true horror of St. Anne's wasn't the ghosts or the things that lurked within its walls. It was far worse. The true horror was that once you entered, you never left. Not truly. The building was alive. The darkness was alive. The cursed souls it claimed could never leave. But they could never forget either. They were trapped in an eternal loop, endlessly reliving their last moments. Theirs was a fate worse than death. It wasn't the finality of dying that kept them there. It was the endless torment of knowing they would never escape, never see the world again, and always be drawn back, over and over, into the hospital's cursed embrace. Each time someone crossed the threshold, the hospital's hunger grew, and once again it waited. Years passed, and the hospital stood as a monument to all that had been lost. No one spoke of it openly anymore, but the dark, decaying structure was always there, looming over the town like a silent predator. No one dared to approach it, and yet the stories never stopped. Those who ventured too close, those who ignored the warnings, slowly faded from the town's memory. Some say that when the fog is thickest, the whispers are the loudest. Some claim that in the silence of the night, they hear the names of those who've been lost, beckoning, calling to anyone who will listen. The cycle was endless, and so it was that the next soul was drawn into the madness. The town had long since turned its back on StAnnesHospital. Time moved on, and the once ominous building faded from the minds of most. But there were still those who remembered, the elders, the survivors, the few who had once ventured too close. They could still hear the whispers on the wind, still felt the cold breath of the building in their nightmares. The hospital, though, remained untouched. No one dared to go near it anymore, for fear that it would reach out and claim them just as it had done to so many before. It sat silently, waiting, always waiting. But what the town didn't know was that the hospital had never truly been abandoned, for it wasn't just the souls of the lost that lingered there. The very essence of the building itself had been consumed by the darkness that had seeped into its foundations, twisting everything that was once alive within it. And with each passing year, it grew stronger. Then one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the fog rolled in thick from the sea, a figure approached. They were a stranger to the town, someone who had heard the stories, who had been drawn by the myth, a curious traveler, eager to see for themselves the truth behind the rumors. They had no idea what they were walking into. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the distant wind carrying whispers of names lost to time. The building silhouette was now more a thing of nightmares than a real structure, an empty shell of forgotten horror. But the stranger, fueled by nothing more than an insatiable need to know, stepped forward, crossing the gates of the old hospital. The moment their foot passed through the threshold, the whispers began. You should not be here. You will never leave. The darkness is waiting. The building seemed to breathe around them. The air grew cold, then colder still. Shadows stretched unnaturally, pulling toward the newcomer. The stranger's heart began to race, and their breath quickened. But they couldn't turn back now. They had come to find out the truth. They descended deeper into the hospital's labyrinthine corridors, their flashlight flickering in and out. The whispers followed them, growing louder with each step, more insistent, more terrifying. We are the lost. Join us, like the others. You will never leave. And then there was the basement door. It stood there, just as it had for all the others before, cold, dark, waiting. The stranger hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open and stepping into the room. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the very air pressing against them. And there in the center stood the altar, dark and stained with a history of suffering. The stranger's heart pounded as the shadows seemed to move, the air growing heavy with the weight of all the lost souls within the hospital. And then they saw it, the faces, the twisted, contorted faces in the mirrors, the faces of those who had entered and never left, now trapped forever in the mirrors of St. Anne's. The stranger could feel the cold, icy fingers of fear grasp at their throat, their breath caught in their chest. They could hear the whispers now, clearer than ever, as the faces in the mirrors reached out, their eyes wide with horror. This is your end. You will never escape. The stranger turned to flee, but the door slammed shut, and they were surrounded by shadows that stretched long and cruel, wrapping themselves around their body, pulling them into the cold embrace of the darkness. There was no scream. The hospital was silent. And then, as the wind outside howled louder, the hospital settled back into its haunting stillness, its walls echoing only with the whispers of the lost souls who still roamed within. Epilogue, the last warning. The stranger was never seen again. Their disappearance added to the countless others who wandered too close to the cursed hospital, their names swallowed by time. The town continued to thrive, the memory of St. Anne slowly fading, becoming nothing more than a whispered story told around campfires. But if you listen closely, if you dare to wander near the edge of the fog on a cold night, you could still hear it. The whispers, faint at first, then clearer as the wind picked up. Names, pleas, desperate call for help. The darkness of St. Anne's Hospital had never been truly defeated. It waited, patient, hungry, eternal. The building was no longer just a structure. It was a prison, a monument of those who had come and never returned. And as long as the whispers echoed, as long as the fog rolled in thick and heavy, the cycle would never end. The hospital waits. And as it waits, it calls. And someone, somewhere, will answer. The end.